This is World Civilization. My name is Dr. Long. This video is entitled Oil in the Modern Context. Oil is an essential energy to the modern economy. In many ways, the global economy today could not function without oil. In 2017, the world consumed 2.3 million barrels of oil each day. This level of oil consumption was not always the case. And it may not always be the case in the future either. Now, oil was used on a large scale for the first time during the 19th century. This was made possible in 1848 when British inventor James Young first refined crude oil. Young's discovery allowed for the refining of petroleum into oil products such as kerosene and gasoline, and helped make both the oil industry and the internal combustion engine possible. From the 1850s until the 1890s, oil was almost exclusively used for lamps, used for lighting and heating, particularly kerosene lamps. As the United States, Canada, and Western Europe were experiencing growing industrial economies and populations in this period, the demand for kerosene continually increased. This led to the growth of a number of oil companies, including one of the largest early oil companies, John Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which became a major company in the United States. Standard Oil was an American company that cornered much of the American oil market through monopolistic practices of controlling refineries. While Standard Oil was eventually broken up into several companies, it made John Rockefeller one of the wealthiest men in the world by the early 20th century. In spite of the oil industry's growth, the most important energy source during the 19th century was another fossil fuel, namely coal. For its part, coal was used widely to power factories, for heating in buildings, to run locomotive railroad engines, and to power the engines of ships. Coal was also a key ingredient in the steel-making process. And coal remained the leading energy source in industrialized nations until the 1950s, when oil replaced it. Now, what gave oil a big boost in the 1890s was the invention of the internal combustion engine, a very efficient, powerful engine which became used in automobiles, airplanes, and ships in the following decades. Yet automobiles were not affordable for most people until the 1920s and 1930s. Tanks, planes, and trucks were used in the First World War. And after the war, armies across the world increasingly switched over to motorized vehicles, while navies changed from ships powered by coal to those powered by oil. So by the 1930s and 1940s, oil was increasingly playing a very important role commercially for transportation and for military equipment. Access to oil played a vital role in the strategies that Axis nations used during the Second World War. For instance, Japan did not have any oil of its own. It was dependent on oil imports to keep its military machine in China running during the war. The United States government placed an embargo on American oil sales to Japan in the summer of 1941 due to Japanese imperial conquest in Asia. Japan saw the American oil embargo as a threat, and this led them to decide to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, an event that brought the United States in the war. The Japanese would struggle throughout the rest of the war to secure adequate oil supplies for their military to continue to fight. Now, likewise in Europe, oil played a major role in Axis strategy there. Germans and Italian forces attempted to attack Egypt, which was controlled by the British, in large part to take the Suez Canal and to take oil in the Middle East. The German attack on Stalingrad in the Soviet Union in 1942 and 1943 was in part motivated by Germany's desire to seize Soviet oil reserves to the south of Stalingrad in the Caucasus Mountains. Germany and Italy's North African campaign to take Egypt was a failure, while Germany's defeat at Stalingrad was the turning point of the war itself. So oil strategy was key to the way the Second World War was fought. Now, after the Second World War, oil became even more important. Industrialized nations increasingly changed from coal to oil as their main energy source. The automobile became even more popular in the Western world during the 1950s and 1960s, as did commercial airplanes. Commercial aviation became widespread after the 1950s, allowing for rapid and global travel on a level never seen before in the past. On a similar note, modern agriculture came to use machinery such as tractors and combines that were also powered by gasoline. And gasoline, of course, as we know, is refined from oil. Oil was also used to make many plastics and as a power source for some electric plants. For the first 30 years or so after the Second World War, world oil prices were very low. And low oil prices helped the economies of Western nations to experience strong growth in this period. So from the 1940s through the 1960s, low oil prices were essential to the growth of the economies in the Western world. In 1960, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or otherwise known as OPEC, was formed. OPEC nations collectively control much of the world's oil supply. Now, most but not all of OPEC nations are Middle Eastern nations. The complicated and often volatile situation in the Middle East came to have an impact on the global oil market. In 1973, after the Yom Kippur War between Israel and many Arab states, a war that Israel ultimately won, OPEC declared an oil embargo against the United States and other nations that supported Israel. The 1973-1974 OPEC oil embargo led to oil shortages, high prices, and ultimately a severe recession in the United States and Western Europe. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution there, led to another oil crisis and another economic downturn in the United States and Western Europe. Now, the oil situation stabilized in the 1980s, and oil prices fell again, helping the economy and helping economies in the Western world. However, in 1990, Iraq, led by the dictator Saddam Hussein, invaded the neighboring nation of Kuwait. The big fear was that he would attack and conquer Saudi Arabia next and corner the entire world market for oil, or much of the world market for oil. Saudi Arabia was the world's leading oil supplier and an ally of the United States. So in an operation known as Operation Desert Storm, an American military coalition expelled Iraq from Kuwait in 1991. And this is another example of the influence of oil on conflicts. In recent decades, many scholars have also noted that nations with large oil supplies, whose economies are heavily dependent on oil revenues, such as Saudi Arabia, Libya, Nigeria, Russia, and Venezuela, all of these nations are autocratic, anti-democratic regimes. In addition, elites who control oil supplies often do quite well themselves, but many common people in these countries do not benefit from the country's oil wealth. With a few exceptions, such as Norway and the United States, the existence of large oil reserves in a nation seem to inhibit democracy and encourage more autocratic regimes. So oil does not always benefit people and does not always lead to regimes that favor them. Quite the contrary. Now, since the 1970s, the environmental movement has increasingly focused on the negative role of oil in pollution. In more recent decades, this has extended to concerns about global warming, not to mention oil spills in the oceans. Think of recently the BP spill in the Caribbean. This affected states such as Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida. Now, bigger than that, though, environmentalists worldwide have been very concerned with the role of carbon emissions from oil on global warming. Environmentalists worldwide have sought to end or at least curb carbon emissions. The 2015 Paris Agreement is a good example of a global effort to curb emissions. Now, while the environmental and global warming are important issues, the reality of the matter is that the global economy is still dependent on oil. This dependency will likely only grow in the future, with China and India seeking living standards for their peoples that are on par with Western nations such as the United States. Without oil, cars, planes, ships, and many power plants could not function. We would not have many plastics without oil. In addition, modern agriculture runs on oil, as do modern militaries. Energy sources such as hydroelectric, solar, wind, and nuclear can and do provide some energy. But they also have environmental drawbacks as well and do not produce enough energy to replace oil. If the world suddenly gave up oil, the global economy would crash and mass starvation would likely ensue. And this also raises a final concern with oil, an idea, a very controversial idea, I should say, known as peak oil. And this is the idea that the global oil supply is finite and will eventually run out. Peak oil means that at some point, world oil production will reach a maximum or a peak, and the oil available on the world market will steadily decline thereafter as oil reserves begin to run out. This would lead to a slow and likely economic transition away from oil. Now, some scholars dispute this idea of peak oil. Some think it may not be a very long time until it happens, but it is an idea that is often raised to critique the world's dependency on oil. Now, while oil has led to massive improvements in the standard of living for humans in the 20th and 21st centuries, its impact, as we've seen, has many critics. One final example of a critic of the world's dependence on oil is British philosopher John Gray. John Gray was born in 1948 and he's still alive. John Gray, in his writings, has been very concerned about the environmental impact of humans on Earth, both through pollution and population growth, and both of those things are tied together. Gray is especially worried about the potential of humans in the modern world to seriously damage the environment, an environment that makes human life possible to thrive in the first place. Now, Gray, for his point, is especially skeptical of utopian thinking, whether rooted in political ideologies such as Marxism or liberal democracy, with its faith in technology. For Gray, the entire notion of progress is a modern myth, even a superstition. Now, whatever one makes of Gray's ideas, critics such as Gray have a point about considering where our dependency on oil may lead us in the future. So let's draw a few conclusions. Oil became the dominant energy source in the 20th century, fueling the internal combustion engine, an efficient engine used in cars, planes, and ships. The type of lifestyle that most Americans and many people throughout the world enjoy today would not be possible without oil. This includes rapid transportation, agricultural improvements, and plastics. Yet oil has serious downsides as well. It seems to encourage autocratic regimes and to discourage democracy. As with other fossil fuels such as coal, oil has also had a negative impact on the environment. Yet because of its central role in the economies of many nations, it's hard to imagine the world completely turning against oil unless a better, cheaper alternative fuel is found. At the moment, oil is a dilemma that the world has not found a solution to, namely finding a less polluting energy source that is still efficient and allows us to live a comfortable modern lifestyle. The world has not completely resolved this dilemma. We're still grappling with this today, and likely will grapple with it for some time to come. And I'll stop with this observation, with this problem, you might say. Thanks for watching.